Guest speaker this morning, this afternoon. I first met about 10 years ago. I was a course at uni, summer school course, and creative writing your own life history. And I thought it was a one-off session. At the end of the session, Rosemary turned around and said, if anybody's interested, we run a group that gets together every second week and we write stories. As I say, that was 10 years ago, so almost every second week for 10 years I've been writing these stories. And I've written about 120, 130. And needless to say, a lot of them are Air Force aviation type stories, and I tend to get rubbish by the others in the group, say, oh, for Christ's sake, not again, not another Air Force type story. Anyway, so having for 10 years, Rosemary's been organising these courses. What happens, she'd throw a topic in the middle of the room, we'd draft out some ideas, and then we'd write for 15, 20 odd minutes, maybe a bit longer, have a cup of coffee, and then we'd each read our stories. Now, the last meeting, about a month ago, for the first time, Rosemary starts to tell me about the fact that she was on board that British aircraft, BOAC aircraft, that flew past the Volcano, and the aircraft got caught up in all the dust, and the 4 engines flamed out. And I'm thinking to myself, I've known you for 10 years, talking about Air Force aviation problems week after week after week, and it'd taken all this time for it. And of course, as soon as I found out what she had been, and she was on board the aircraft with I believe a daughter and a family, but she'll give you the details in a minute. So I told Brian, and needless to say, Brian's collared her into coming up and talking to us. So please, Rosemary Stevens, you are our next guest speaker.
So, well, I'd first of all like to thank you all very much for inviting me to come along and talk about my experiences on board British Airways flight BA9. So this was, interestingly enough, it was almost about 33 years ago to the day. It was the 24th of June, 1982, and today is the 26th of June. So we've just gone past that 33rd anniversary. Yes, it is spooky, very spooky, and it's something I never think about and don't mention generally, as Ken says. And it's been a very interesting experience for me researching more about what actually was going on, because I didn't really, I heard bits and pieces, but I didn't really understand what was going on in the cockpit, or I didn't understand how incredibly lucky I am to be standing here talking to you today. So I'm going to talk to you about that experience. So that's if we can move on to the slide next. So it was a BA 747-200, and I've got some details on the next slide. So this flight went down, if you'll pardon the pun, in history as one of the most famous commercial airliner ever to fly. It was a Boeing 747 236B, and it was named City of Edinburgh, also known as Speedbird 9, and that's the registration number if anybody is interested in that. So how did we come to be on this flight? Well, I was there with my husband Pete and our 11-month-old son Francis. We had moved to Perth about 18 months before, and we'd been back to the UK to show off the new baby, essentially, and we were on our way back. And now this flight, if we go to the next slide, it was scheduled to go from Heathrow via India, specifically stopping off at Bombay and Madras, and then to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and then on to Perth, and then Melbourne, and then Auckland, so quite a long flight. Now, interestingly enough, I have this vivid memory of Pete and I sitting in the chaos of Heathrow Airport, feeling incredibly anxious. We were really reluctant to get on that flight. It's true that we had booked a bassinet for the baby all the way through, and that there wasn't now one available from the leg from Kuala Lumpur to Perth. And so we were going to have to juggle Francis between us on our laps. And the check-in staff were very unhelpful, a bit standoffish and take it or leave it. But it really wasn't any of that. We just felt we did not want to get on that flight. We were very, very anxious. But there wasn't anything else for another 24 hours, and so we decided, what the heck, we'll just go with it. So we did board the flight. And strangely enough, it felt still very uneasy, very uncomfortable, and the staff seemed to be very harassed. It wasn't a good flight. We still felt very uneasy all the way to KL. Now, strangely enough, once we got to KL and the new flight staff boarded, the new crew boarded the plane, we instantly relaxed. We just felt, as Pete said, this crew was handpicked, and we knew nothing to worry about anymore. Whatever it was that had been concerning us, we were sure that everything was going to be fine from now on. Well, now, what we didn't know was that the cabin crew, the flight crew were equally hand-picked. There was the captain, who was an experienced pilot. He was Eric Moody, 41-year-old, and he began his career at the age of 16 as training in a glider. Now, this experience turned out to be more valuable than he might have imagined. And he was one of the first pilots to train on board a Boeing 747. Now, there was also the co-pilot, who had been a co-pilot for 6 years, Roger Greaves, and there was the flight engineer, Barry Townley Freeman. Now, on this particular, on this leg, this flight was going to be heading, it was going to fly past Jakarta in Java, and then it was going to start tracking over to the east and make landfall around Karratha and to go down to Perth. Now, what none of us knew was what had been going on the ground, and if the ground crew, ground staff at in Java, in Jakarta, knew this, they were obviously not concerned. So perhaps if we go to the next slide now. What had happened earlier that day was that Mount Galunggung had erupted. This is a photograph of its erupting in 1982. Now, as you know, as we now all know, volcanoes can cause an incredible amount of destruction. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a whole chain of volcanoes along here, and some of them are very well known. So this Tambora, for example, is one slightly to the east of Galunggung, and that erupted in 1815, causing the year without a summer in Europe, where thousands of people died because of crop failure, basically, because of the incredible haze from this volcano. So, and funnily enough, it's the 200th anniversary this year of that volcano. That was the year when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, triggered by this dark summer. So that's how destructive they can be. Well now, interestingly too, this particular chain is called the Sunda Arc, this chain of volcanoes that reach all the way down from the Philippines and all the way along the spine of Java, as you can see in this diagram here. And these are, as long as the Australian plate continues to move northwards, as it is now as we speak, at the rate about the same as your fingertips grow or your hair. That's how fast or slowly this is constantly moving. And so, understandably, there's a lot of volcanic activity. And on this particular day, unbeknown to us, Galunggung had erupted. So if we go to the next slide, this is a photograph of a volcanic ash. And as you can see, how very nasty that looks and what a lot of destruction that can cause, as described. Now this was heading directly into our flight path. So we go to the next slide. This is actually the ash cloud from Mount Galunggung in 1982. And it was heading straight for us. Now this was night time. The flight took off from KL, just slightly overdue, and it was a comfortable flight. We'd been flying for about 1.5 hours, and we had got to, we'd gone past Jakarta, and we were heading further south towards the sea. It was a clear night, And so in the cockpit, Moody and Greaves and Barry, they couldn't see a cloud in sight. They checked the weather radar and confirmed that it was going to be plain sailing. And so the captain, Moody, he handed over to the co-pilot and he went for a stroll. Now, inside the cabin, we felt very settled. The meal had been served and the lights had been dimmed. And we just settled back and began to relax. And even Francis, the baby, seemed quite settled. So it looked like it was going to be a very uneventful flight. Now, back in the cockpit, with Greaves and Barry, the co-pilot and the flight engineer, they were just minding the shop. It was a very dark night. But then they noticed these very strange like fireflies that were attacking the windscreen. And they thought, this is very odd. You know, what could that be? Could it be St. Elmo's fire, something that you would all be familiar with as pilots? But it couldn't really be that, because this is caused by electrical activity due to thunderstorms and lightning, and there was no sign of lightning anywhere. So they checked the weather radar again, and sure enough, nothing in sight. They checked the other instruments, absolutely nothing amiss. And yet, these flickers of light, like little pinpricks of light, kept attacking the windscreen. They thought, something's not quite right here. So they decided to call Moody back, the captain. Now, Moody, on his way back, he noticed that the cabin was beginning to fill with smoke, really subtly at first, and he thought to himself, well, could this be, you know, a cigarette that's smouldering somewhere? Because remember, in 1982, smoking was allowed on commercial airlines, and meanwhile, the stewards and stewardesses were scurrying around to check. But this was different, because if it was smoke from a cigarette, that would have dissipated and it would have started to disappear through the air conditioning system. But this wasn't happening. It was a darker kind of ash, and it seemed, if anything, to be thickening. It was pouring in through the air conditioning vents, and there was also this acrid smell that came with it. And so Moody thought, well, that's odd. But when he got to the cockpit, he found that that also was filled with smoke, and there was this smell too. So what was going on here? Meanwhile, I remember in the cabin, sitting there and just thinking to myself, now imagine this, the lights have been dimmed, and we were kind of dozy, and I kind of looked around and thought, are my eyes just a little dim, or perhaps a bit sleepy, and everything's just a little bit hazy. Oh well, maybe nothing to worry about particularly. But there was also that smell. Well, then there was a kind of a grinding sound and a sort of shudder and a kind of faltering sensation. I thought, oh. And then the seatbelt signs came on. So we thought, oh well, turbulence, that's understandable in the tropics, so we belted ourselves in. Now, meanwhile, back in the cockpit, the flight crew were checking all the instruments. There were, still nothing showing up on the radar, nothing amiss showing up with anything. And they were very puzzled, because now not only had there been these pinpricks on the windscreen, but now there were definitely much more marked St. Elmo's fire effects. And what Barry and Greaves had done is that they had turned on the landing lights to see if they could see anything more about what these pinpricks of light were. And they were very disturbed to find that around the plane there seemed to be this mysterious kind of cloud, which was nonetheless not showing up at all on any of the instruments. And it didn't look like cloud exactly, but it was definitely a sort of misty, thin kind of cloud. So, what was going on here? They were very puzzled. Well, just as they were trying to work out what this could be, suddenly Greaves, the co-pilot, he said, "Oh my lord, look at that." engine number 4 suddenly lit up. Well, before the captain could respond, he was distracted by, on his side, by another engine also lighting up. They thought, what on earth is going on here? The next thing, they seemed to be flying into blinding white light. And so, you know, what to do? They had no idea what was happening. And so they decided, well, we'll have to do something. But just as they were working out, you know, what they ought to do, that's when one of the engines cut out. I think it was engine number 4, surged and flamed and cut out. So at least now they kind of knew what they needed to do. They needed to go into automatic mode and restart that engine. But first they needed to shut it down. So first shut down that engine so that it wouldn't compromise the other 3 engines. So they were going through the procedure to shut down the engine when all of a sudden another engine surged, flamed and cut out. Now I remember inside the cabin, I didn't see the St. Elmo's effects as other passengers did. They described it as a kind of ethereal blue mauvey light playing around the wings. Now I was sitting on the starboard side on the right, and I could see out of my window the wing, and what I saw were flames, these massive flames pouring out of the engine. And I thought to myself, you know, something's not right here. Something is not right here. And meanwhile, the cabin was filling with more and more ash. Now, it was definitely something. We didn't know that it was ash. We didn't know what it was. And the flight crew had no idea either what this was. And on the ground, nobody knew what this was. But there was definitely something, you know, it was like looking across to the other side of the cabin and you could see your fellow passengers disappearing, almost like you were caught inside one of those grainy Kodak films, you know, the photograph where things were kind of black and white and hazy. We thought, oh, this isn't right. And the lights began to flicker on and off, and there was more grinding, more shuddering. Now, of course, as you can imagine, people were asking the stewards, stewardesses, you know, well, what's going on? And the chief steward, Skinner, he said, oh, nothing to worry about, just a minor hiccup. And whilst he said this, of course, his blood was running cold because he knew that this was much more than a minor hiccup. And he said, well, if he was misleading passengers, it was because he was trying to calm them down to a level of much more calm than he actually was feeling. But this was pretty impressive, really. Well, meanwhile, back in the cockpit, they were frantically trying to shut down the other engine, restart the one that had first flamed out, and then within the space of a very short time, the other 2 engines cut out as well. And so within 2 minutes, all 4 engines had failed. So now the plane had become a massive glider. And they didn't know what to do because they did not know what had caused this problem. And of course, for us, meanwhile, sitting in the cabin, everything was dark, pitch black, all the electrics had failed. And we were sinking. And still I seem to remember these flames. I don't know, that could be right because maybe if they'd cut out, maybe they weren't flaming, but I seem to remember that it seemed to be flaming all the time. That's in my memory, I don't know. But certainly this was very now alarming. Now, amazingly, there was no sense of panic on board. Certainly there was a sense of fear, kind of like a raw fear, and there was this eerie silence, absolute eerie silence. I mean, you know how noisy it is on board an aircraft. It was absolutely silent and it was absolutely dark, and there was this thick mist inside the plane and this smell, and we were sinking. Now, in the cockpit, what I should say first is now, amazingly, I think this is quite remarkable. I told you how Skinner was very reassuring of all the passengers that this was a hiccup. Well, remarkably, at this moment, the intercom crackled and there was an announcement from the captain, which I think is remarkable because when you consider what they were battling with in the cockpit, the fact that he thought, oh, you know, better reassure the passengers. So then here comes the captain's voice, and he says, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our darndest to get them going again. I hope you are not in too much distress. Well, if that's not an example of English sang-froid, I don't know what is. But we did feel reassured. We thought, well, you know, that confirms our worst suspicions. That's exactly what it feels like. But obviously, you know, they've got it under control. Well, I mean, to be honest, we were very, you know, we really didn't think we had much chance. We thought, okay, this is it. We're probably plummeting to our deaths here. But at least, you know, the captain, we're in good hands anyway, the best hands we could be. So there we were. And now, in the meantime, in the cockpit, Greaves, the co-pilot, sends a Mayday message to Jakarta, to ground control. Now, they still had communication with ground control, but it was getting intermittent. And nevertheless, this message did get through clearly, and the message was, Mayday, all 4 engines have failed, and the details of that flight. And now, how frustrating is this? The message that came back to Greaves was, oh, do you have a problem? And needless to say, Greaves thought, well, this is a real problem because, you know, they needed to get this message through to ground control so that they could relay the message to any other aircraft that were below in our direct descent path because we were going down. So he tried again. He sent the message through again. Mayday, Mayday, all 4 engines have failed. This time the message came back, oh, do you have a problem with engine 4? And meanwhile, of course, valuable time was being lost in order to try and at least clear the aircraft from underneath. Well, finally, a Garuda aircraft was able to pick up the message and relay it to Jakarta so that they did get the message and then they understood what was going on. But in the meantime, communications were faltering. So, you know, this was a very grim situation. Of course, the crew were desperately trying to restart those engines. As you know, they have regular training in simulators, but for whatever reason, they were not restarting. And they still had no idea why this had happened. So now, Moody was faced with an enormous dilemma. You know, here he is trying to control this enormous glider plane. In fact, this flight went down in the Guinness Book of Records as the longest gliding flight in a non-specific, you know, aircraft. But what are they going to do? I mean, what should he do? Should he maintain the height as best possible to give them as much time as they needed to try and restart the engine? Or the risk with that is that possibly the cabin could depressurize and there'd be a loss of oxygen? Or should he try to go a little bit lower? But then if he did that, there's mountainous terrain looming from underneath. So he really, you know, what was he going to do? Well, for us, in the meantime, there we were in the cabin, just continuing to drop and drop and drop. And it was very quiet. There was a sense of absolute concentration. You know, there's nothing that focuses the mind better than the prospect of death, I guess. And we were all either saying our prayers or just very, very focused on calling on some sort of assistance, or just being in the moment, trying to deal with this situation. But no panic still. And then, yes, it's interesting what runs through your mind, isn't it? I remember that what ran through my mind was, oh, Mum, you know, Mum, I'm so sorry, you know, that you won't see the baby grow up, and how much she would miss us. And then after a while I thought, well, you know, at least we're all together, the three of us. And then the next thought was, oh no, we'll be all right, you know, we'll land in the sea and we'll get into life rafts and we'll be rescued. But then, you know, really, we all knew that this was it. We were actually plummeting to our depths, and there was nothing that we could do about it. Well, in the meantime, the next thing that happened was, this was incredibly spooky. The next thing that happened was the masks dropped down. So just imagine this, there we are in the aircraft, and then all these masks suddenly dropped down, and they sort of swung like nooses from a hangman's gallows. And, you know, you just kind of, it's just this kind of silence. And then a kind of forest of tentative hands that reached up to pull the masks down and put them onto our faces. Now, I then was faced with another problem entirely, because, I mean, you know, we've all seen the in-flight safety procedures, haven't we? The nicely coiffed mother and the very obedient daughter sitting next to her, you know, smiling. She puts her mask on and then she turns and helps her daughter on with hers, and, you know, it's all very calm. Well, when you've got an 11-month-old baby, you know, I put my mask on, Pete put his mask on. You try putting a mask on an 11-month-old baby. You know, they're really not interested. I mean, to start with, he wanted to play with it. You know, this is not a plaything. And then, so I was trying to put it on. No, he was fighting this thing off. He wasn't going to have this mask on. And then I was worried that he was going to get very anxious and upset, because until this moment, he'd actually been remarkably calm. He was probably the only passenger on board that was oblivious to our plight. So I thought, oh, you know, what to do? But then I realised that actually my mask wasn't making any difference. It felt similar to me to when we went trekking in the Himalayas. And, you know, when you go up to a certain altitude, you can breathe, but of course the air is a lot thinner. Well, it felt like that. I could breathe. The air was, you know, it was much more difficult to breathe, but I could breathe. And I thought, well, you know, with my mask on, it doesn't feel any better. So I thought, you know what, I think I'm going to just lift my mask off, and as long as I can breathe, I'll just assume that the baby can breathe as well. So I thought, I'm going to put him on the breast, I'll just breastfeed him, we'll go down breastfeeding. You know, that's what we'll do, like every good mother should do. So that was our plight. And then the most extraordinary vision appeared. Now, I'll never forget this. Out of this thick mist, it was pitch black, silent, we are dropping and dropping and dropping. And then out of this mist looms what looked like an alien from outer space. And it turned out to be the air hostess, who appeared with her mask on and a tube that ran to the back where she had an oxygen tank on her back. And she walked down that aisle and stood there, and her presence was so reassuring and calming. And I thought to myself, you know, this is extraordinary. Surely their instructions would be to strap themselves in and put their masks on as well. And here she was, standing there knowing full well that we were all going to our deaths, that she was too. and she just stood there. And I thought, right, we're going, and we're going in style. and there was absolute calm still on that plane, and I'm sure a lot of it has to do with that wonderful crew. Well, now, so what was going on back in the cockpit there? Well, they'd lost control, they'd lost contact completely with ground control, and they now were furiously trying to reignite the engines. But of course the masks had also come down in the cockpit as well, so they put their masks on, and as it turns out, the flight engineer's mask, Barry, was faulty. It wasn't working properly, and so now Moody had another dilemma. He thought, oh, well, I can't afford for him to black out. I really need all hands on deck. So I am simply going to have to go lower, because then the oxygen supply will be better. So of course that would mean losing precious height, losing precious time to restart these engines. But at the same time, and of course the mountains are looming from below. I mean, as you would all be aware, there is an optimal height for restarting these engines. I'm sure we would have reached it by now, but he decided to take a nosedive. So he did. He took a nosedive. I believe it was 60,000 feet in 1 minute. 6,000 feet in 1 minute. And now, interestingly enough, that the combination of that, this mask of the Barrys, the flight engineers, the fact that that was faulty actually is what saved our lives, because when this nosedive occurred and they went lower, 6,000 feet lower, they flew out of the ash cloud into denser, moister, clearer air. And as a result of that, this dislodged some of the particles in the engines. And so engine number 4 coughed into life. I mean, you imagine they'd been trying to relight these engines, and then this engine coughed into life. Just one engine, which wouldn't be enough to take us anywhere, but it coughed into life. And I remember this myself. Now, 16 minutes is a long time to be dropping. You know, I mean, it feels timeless, but it was 16 minutes. And we can probably have some more slides. I completely forgot about the slide. That's the aftermath, actually, of that particular eruption. So you can see how destructive that is. So if we go to the next slide, that's where the trouble happened. And then we go to the next slide. Yeah, this is a picture of the St Elmo's fire effects. So rather beautiful. And then the next slide. And here we go. Now we were at 37,000 feet. Here comes the volcano, and then there comes the plane, and then the next thing is we're dropping and dropping and dropping. And then this engine coughs into life. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, hang on a minute, is that a sound? I don't think we're dropping anymore. And it felt as if we were stabilising, which was a fantastic feeling. We were still very tentative, and we were still hanging on to see what was going to happen next. Well, then, fortunately, engine number 2, or it was engine number 3, coughed into life as well. So now there were 2 engines, and then shortly after that, the other 2 came on as well. This was an enormous relief. In the meantime, yes, an understatement. Understatement, that's right. In the meantime, actually, what Moody had done, because we were still tracking towards the sea away from Jakarta, but while we were still gliding, what he had decided to do was to turn the aircraft and head back towards Jakarta in the hope that they would be able to start engines and that they could make a full-powered landing. Well then, as a result of having descended somewhat, the engine started, and so now they were able to gain some more height. Because as you can see from this diagram, really, by the time those engines kicked in again, we really weren't too far from crashing into the mountains. We'd lost an awful lot of heat. So it's about 13,000 feet when we gained some power again. So now they begin to climb back up. And what they need now is they need to gain some height, to give themselves some leeway, and it's like a safety distance really, so that they, in case anything else goes wrong, while they try and track back to Jakarta, because this is what they now plan to do. And fortunately communications came back as well. So it sounded like Jakarta was going to be able to help them to land the plane, which is fantastic because, you know, Moody had been doing all this manually, and it was very stressful. But there was still more problems because having gained the height, what happened was that the engine flared out again. It flamed and died once more. And they began to realize that there was obviously a connection with the height and with what was going on with the engine. So they didn't know what it was. They still had no idea what the problem was. Did not know, as we now know, that they'd flown through this enormous ash cloud. But they did know that, okay, the height and the St. Elmo's fire effects came back again, and then this engine flamed out. So obviously there's a connection. So then Moody decided we're going to have to descend to a lower level, because by this time a second engine had also choked and cut out. So he dropped to a low level, and they continued to work to start these engines, and they did begin to. They managed to get 3 engines going, but they never did get the other one going. And now back in the cabin, I remember another announcement coming through. We were obviously all just, you know, holding on and hoping that things were going to be all right. And then this announcement came through from Captain Moody. You know, this is your captain speaking, ladies and gentlemen. We are shortly going to be landing in Jakarta. An enormous relief. And now Pete seems to remember that he also gave us the news that we were going to be landing on 3 engines. And that was fine by me, but he says that in his case, that's when he went to pieces. Up until then, he'd kind of been okay because you just kind of deal with it, I guess. And then suddenly he thought, oh my God, and he sort of lost it. And he said from that day until recently, he's really been scared of flying. But from my point of view, I just thought, okay, well, you know, let's hope that we make it. But we didn't realize how difficult things still were, because in the cockpit, okay, they managed to maintain a reasonable height, and the communications from Jakarta informed them that they were about 108 miles south-southeast of Jakarta. So they're heading for Jakarta. Now, the mysterious thing is, I didn't mention before that shortly before they lost communication, when the engines had cut out, they were not showing up on the ground radar at all. They should have been at the altitude that they were and the speed that they were flying, but for whatever reason, you know, Jakarta wasn't picking them up. And also, I learned from my researches, as many of you would know probably, that the reason that no cloud showed up on the radar at any time was because the weather radar is tuned to pick up moisture, and that's how it detects cloud. And of course, the ash is dry, and so it wasn't picking it up. So meanwhile, you know, here we are heading for Jakarta. The flight crew still have no idea what happened. They don't know what is going to happen, and so they request that there be fire engines on standby at the airport. Because, you know, for all Moody knew, when we landed, maybe the plane would burst into flames. Really didn't know, had no idea what had caused all this trouble, or if we would even make it. But it was okay now. He thought, I'm going to be able to hand over to the ground control. But as it happens, as he got closer to Jakarta, for whatever reason, the equipment on the ground, the landing equipment, wasn't functioning. And so again, he was going to have to land this plane manually. Now, just picture this. The windscreen had been completely blasted by the volcanic ash, and he really couldn't see at all. And the instruments were faulty as well. But somehow he was going to have to try and land on the runway manually. Now, I was puzzled about something that I couldn't find out from my researchers, but luckily just now I was talking to Andy Anderson, and he explained to me what happened with the landing was that there's a metal strip down the front of the windscreen, and as the ash blew against this, it left a narrow strip, a very narrow strip, through which Moody could see, but I mean hardly at all. And this is what he was going to have to try and cope with. So it's night time, mercifully it's a clear night, but he's going to have to try and land at night with faulty instruments, with ground control, landing equipment not working, and he's going to have to try to look through this tiny little crack and bring us safely down in this emergency landing. Of course, fortunately we didn't know that, but of course we still knew it was a very tense situation, and we were bracing ourselves for the landing. And do you know, the remarkable thing is that when that plane landed, it was a smooth landing. It was just a smooth, perfect landing. And a cheer of applause went up from all of us, you know, to applaud the crew. And just, you know, the relief, it was just extraordinary. And the fire engines weren't needed. We disembarked in an orderly fashion, and I don't remember. Ken asked me, he said, do you remember what the airplane looked like from the outside? To be honest, I don't remember what it looked like. I was just very thankful to get off it. And what I do remember is standing in the airport afterwards, and you know, gathering with the other passengers. I remember a South African family in particular, and you know, we were probably in a state of shock, and you know, just murmured a few things to each other, and then we just were embracing each other. You just felt completely bonded with these people that had been utter strangers before, and that was when it hit me. I remember my legs suddenly went weak, and I just, you know, understood what had happened. Oh my God, you know, that was a close shave. And since then, of course, we had to, the next day, get on a flight after staying overnight in Jakarta. And I do admit that that was a daytime flight, it was an afternoon flight, going from Jakarta to Perth. And I do remember feeling incredibly nervous as we sat on that plane. But I sort of said to myself, look, what are the chances, you know, of anything else going amiss? And we made it safely, and I've never been afraid of flying since. Now, as a result of what had happened there has been the Galungong Gliders Club has been formed, and that is a club for survivors, you know, who meet annually all over the world. And we were invited to the first meeting, which was at the Sheraton Hotel in Perth. It was going to be in the basement. And we sort of tossed up, should we go, shouldn't we go? And we thought, oh, I don't think we will somehow. But we didn't. But then we heard afterwards that a fire broke out in the basement while they were during their meeting, and that they all had to evacuate the building. So we kind of thought to ourselves, do we really want to hang out with this crowd? You know? Yeah. So, but as a result of what happened on that flight, that really changed the pilot training all over the world. And now pilots are much more alert to the dangers. They're told to look for the signs, you know, St Elmo's fire effects, and also any sulfuric smell, and that kind of thing. And of course, now they've gone overboard, if you pardon the expression, that in 2010, when there was the Icelandic earthquake eruption, volcanic eruption, flights were grounded for almost a week all over Europe. So now, you know, it's very unlikely that anything like that would happen. But the extraordinary thing is, throughout that whole event, no one knew what was going on. We had got no idea. And the crew, even after the event, immediately after, they didn't know what had happened, and only found out later. They might be interested in the next slide, which is this is the damaged engine part from Flight BA9 is on display at Auckland Museum. So I don't know if you can see very much of that. I think that looks like I don't know whether that's a piece of a volcanic ash there too, but you know, I thought that might be an interest to you as well. Yeah. Can you see what that is? That's the fan blades.
You can see the fir tree fitting at the base there.
I see, a fir tree fitting at the base, right, yeah. So, you know, really, I feel I'm incredibly fortunate to be here talking about this event. And I never realised how fortunate I was until after I did this research. So I'm very grateful, actually, for the opportunity. So, yeah, so thank you very much. Now, yeah, any questions? I don't know if I'll be able to answer them.
Thank you, Rosemary. I happen to be an ex-student of yours at the similar course.
I recognise you.
Right, and I thank you for that. It's been enjoyable ever since because of that. And I've enjoyed your talk today immensely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But I'm interested to know what the reaction of the airline was. How did they approach you? What has been the activities after all this incident?
Yes, well, the crew received many awards, actually, and quite rightly too. And they are part of this club. Yes, many of the crew members are also part of the club. And as I say, I haven't actually pursued it myself, but I understand that they're you know, very supportive and very friendly. And I suppose that it's been a healing thing to be able to meet up and to be able to talk about it and you know, debrief. I mean, yeah.
The airline, what did BA do? You know, how did they approach it all?
Right. You mean in regards to talking to us about what had happened? I didn't receive anything at all, actually. No communication, no letter. There was only this letter, really, that was initiated by passengers. No, I never. That's a good question. I never thought about that. Never heard anything from British Airways at all. But I tell you what, you know, we had been so disgruntled about, you know, the lack of help when we were, you know, wondering about changing our flight at Heathrow, and then, you know, everyone seemed so harassed that we had thought, oh, we're never going to fly BA again. But after that event, we thought, yes, we'll definitely be flying BA again. But we didn't actually hear anything from them.
Jeez.
Yeah.